Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'd love to introduce the very special Anthony Peake, an author and researcher known for his work on topics related to consciousness, the nature of reality, and life after death experiences. He explores ideas from neuroscience, quantum physics, and esoteric philosophy to present theories about human perception and existence. One of his most well-known books is The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Self, where he introduces the concept of Daemon as higher aspect of consciousness. And he has written several books, but today we are going to focus on his most recent book on near-death experiences. Welcome, Anthony.
Welcome, Soon. We're looking forward to chatting to you.
Likewise, you're one of the few people I came across who has covered so many different, such a large spectrum of consciousness, like near-death experiences, psychedelics, UFO, quantum. So there's a lot I have to ask you, but today I'm going to focus on near-death experiences.
That sounds wonderful. Sounds good.
Can you first share the history and anthropology of near-death experiences?
No, absolutely. I mean, this is the main area I'm focusing in on in the new book, in that my opinion is that there are many, many excellent books on near-death experiences, but the vast majority of them just seem to focus in on "it happened to me" experiences, you know, where you'll get a list of people who have had experiences and they describe them, the near-death experience. Whereas to me, I'm more interested in the sociological, anthropological aspects and historical aspects of the phenomenon. But just very quickly, to define what we mean when we use the term near-death experience. Near-death experiences were really first brought to the public's attention in a book written in the late 1960s, early 1970s by Dr. Raymond Moody, which was called Life After Death. And Moody was fascinated by the fact of the amazing reports by people who had, when they were close to death, either in car accidents or due to illness or whatever, they consistently reported very, very similar experiences. And he came to the conclusion that this is a general phenomenon. And after his book was published, millions of, well, thousands or tens of thousands of people around the world reported similar experiences. Now, these include experiences of when you're dying, of floating outside of your body, of meeting a being called the being of light, meeting dead relatives, going to another location, having something called a panoramic life review, these kind of things. And these became known as the Moody traits. Now, this is all very well and good, but my argument is, could it be it is just a part of the dying brain? Or is it cultural? Is it something that we experience because we know of the near-death experiences? So what I did in my new book is I took a very different approach by looking back into the history of the near-death experience, not just in Western culture, but in China, in Korea, in India, and various other countries. Because to me, if it is a genuine phenomenon, the certain aspects would not necessarily be culturally based, which is what I focus in on the new book.
So when you say not culturally based, do you also mean it's not psychologically based? It's not
Correct. But I suppose anybody who's read my books will know that I take a very different approach to the whole idea of what is consciousness and what is reality. Because, for instance, we'll turn around and we'll say, well, you know, it's people will argue, for example, that a near-death experience is an hallucination, as if that's an explanation. In other words, because you've categorized it as an hallucination, a brain-generated hallucination, you've therefore explained it. I take a much deeper approach to this, because I say if you go to the neurology and you go to the psychology of hallucinations, you realize that nobody actually knows what an hallucination is. In other words, it's a label. It's an explanatory label. It's a way in which people who don't want to explore any further the implications of these experiences will hide behind. So in other words, they'll turn around and say, I've now explained it. But of course, in reality, using reality in its loosest term, hallucinations themselves, the whole human experience, is an hallucination, in the sense that everything we experience is brain generated. For example, and I always use this example because I think it's a really interesting one. Vision. When we see, we tend to assume that there's a one-to-one relationship between what we see and what is out there in external reality. But the point of the fact is that what we see outside is brain generated, because what happens is these tiny little bits of light called photons, which is effectively what light is. And without going into the quantum mechanics of this, we're even not sure of the nature of light, whether it's a wave or a particle. But not going into detail about that now, but I do in my books, is just imagine that they're tiny bits of light. And what happens is, in effect, bits of light bounce off objects. So you're looking at a red rose, for example. What happens is the photons hit the surface of the rose, and the parts of the color spectrum, all the colors with the exception of red, is taken into the rose, and all that's reflected back off the rose into your eye is the red part of the spectrum. Now those photons then enter your eye and hit the retina on the back of the eye, and as trillions of these photons hit the retina at the back of the eye, an image is formed. And then that image is then translated by the retina into an electric signal, and that signal then goes down what's called the optic nerve, which then goes from both eyes, crosses at one point called the optic chiasma, and then goes back and feeds the visual cortex of the brain at the back of the head. That signal is then reconverted into the image we see. Now, the question here is, the image that is on the retina is postage stamp sized and inverted. So when the image is processed by the retina, that's what it is. It's tiny and it's inverted and bent. That signal is then reprocessed by the brain, that information, and it's turned into this three-dimensional surrounding us image of reality. And as I said, created from a postage stamp inverted image. Not only that, but how the brain creates that, it takes information that is not necessarily in the signal. For instance, at the back of each eye, there's something called a blind spot. So it means that in our visual field, we have a little area that we're blind, we cannot see it. There's nothing there. But the brain fills in the information to give us a kind of clear vision of the world outside. Now, then we get to the question, you get to the visual cortex, and then there's this image that's then created. But it's then presented to something called consciousness, because there has to be somebody there seeing that image, doesn't there? You know, when we're in our head, we kind of think that there's a little version of ourselves, there's a little version of Anthony or a little version of Suma sitting inside your head with a big screen in front of them. And that's what we think vision is. But very quickly that becomes a problem as well, because there must be then another version of Suma inside the visual area of our head, and then another version and another version. It's called an infinite regress. So even the idea of what we see suddenly becomes not quite as clear as we first believe it to be. And believe it or not, scientists who research the nature of reality and the nature of vision call the people who believe that what is really out there and is really in here, and it's the same thing, are called naive realists. And they're called naive because all the science says it's the opposite, that there's something magical taking place here. And of course, science has no idea how your brain creates you. You know, all that's happening in your head is electricity reacting with chemicals. And yet it creates Suma. It creates the wonderful person that creates this webcast, creates this podcast, all the experiences you've had, all the dreams you've had, or when you've been in love, when you have seen a beautiful sunset. That's all created by chemicals. And that is ridiculous. We're not even at first base trying to understand how that is. And in fact, in the mid-1990s, a young Australian philosopher called David Chalmers stood up at the University of Arizona and said, this is the great mystery of modern science. He called it the hard problem of science. How does my brain create me? And we don't know. So turning the question all the way around. So when somebody says that a near-death experience is an hallucination, they're not explaining anything, because reality and the way we perceive reality is an hallucination, as are dreams. Every night, the vast majority of human beings dream. And when you dream, you go into this alternate reality that is so real, you believe it's real. Because if you didn't believe it was real, we'd all realize we were dreaming. But we don't, do you? You know, you go through this dream and you meet people you've never met before, and you're in places you've never been to before. And you don't go, this is really strange. You just accept it. And this is because, yet again, we have this idea of what is out there and what isn't. And I argue that everything is an hallucination, everything we experience. So suddenly these near-death experiences now become much more interesting, because then it's, if they have a reality outside of us in some way, are they different? Within the Indian community, for instance, I've recently come back from southern India. I spent a few weeks down in southern India, and I took the opportunity to talk to people there about what their near-death, did they know people who've had near-death experiences? And they have. And the near-death experiences are virtually identical, with some interesting differences. Because if you are from a Hindu culture, when you have a near-death experience, you will encounter entities or beings when you're in a near-death experience state, but they will reflect your belief system. You'll see Kali, or you'll see manifestations of Brahman. Whereas if you are in a Western Christian culture, people see Jesus. Now, I've got evidence that there are young children who have near-death experiences, who experience meeting up with their school friends who are still alive, or with cartoon characters that they've seen in movies. Now, clearly, whatever the entities are they're experiencing here, they're culturally based. In fact, there's some fascinating examples of near-death experiences where people meet Elvis Presley rather than Jesus. Now, what's going on here? And this is the question I ask about, is it culturally based? And if it is culturally based, what is it telling us about the true nature of whatever this wonderful experience of living is?
Do you think this could be a combination of the influences of our psychological dynamics, or where it kind of like shades the near-death experience?
It does. As my argument goes, hidden universe, I came up with a concept I call the egregorial. And the egregorial is the argument that we effectively co-create reality together. The external reality we think is external to us is created by us, and it's created by every other sentient being. And what we're effectively doing is projecting outwards the reality that we all share. And I'm using the term egregorial quite specifically, and it's from ancient Greek, and the word egregora or egregoros means watchers. The reason why I use this term is that there is evidence from science and evidence from research that our anticipations of what is about to take place makes it come into existence. And this comes down from quantum mechanics and quantum physics. Remember earlier on I mentioned the idea that light is both a wave and a particle. Now, without going into great detail about this, this is one of the great mysteries of modern science. And anybody that says they understand it, don't. Because anybody that says they understand it self-evidently don't. Because it has been discovered that in certain circumstances, light is a wave. Now, a wave is like a wave in water. So you need a medium. So, you throw a stone into some water or a pond, you'll get the ripples going outwards. But of course, without the water, the ripples don't exist. Okay, but that is what a wave is. A wave is a disturbance in a medium. All well and good. And when experiments were done way back in 1801, I think it was, when a guy called Thomas Young, who was a British physicist, started looking at light, he came to the conclusion from his experiments that light is a wave. And you look at light and you see how light has all of the manifestations of waves. It has diffraction, it has all the things that waves do. But there was one big problem. If light is a wave and a wave needs a medium in order to wave in, how do we see the sun? Because the sun is giving off light, but between the sun and the 93 million miles when it gets to Earth is a vacuum. And a vacuum, by definition, has nothing in it. So if space is empty and it has nothing in it, what's doing the waving? You know, how can light, space doesn't wave. And this was a huge problem. And I think in around about 1887, 88, something like that, maybe slightly later, two guys called Michelson and Morley did an experiment to see whether there was a substance in space. In other words, space wasn't a vacuum, but there was something in there that carried the light and the light from the stars. And they call this the luminiferous ether. Luminiferous, for instance, means light carrying. And they did this incredible experiment. And without going into detail, they proved that the ether didn't exist. So there was a huge problem. How did light get from the sun to the earth and everything else? So they concluded, and Albert Einstein came along and went back to the ideas of Isaac Newton, and said, well, actually, light is little tiny particles. Now, if light is made of little tiny particles, you don't need a wave, do you? Because if it's a tiny little particle, a little hard ball, as it were, that can travel through space. It doesn't need a medium to wave. But a series of experiments that have been done that shows that light is both. It's both a wave and a particle. And what is fascinating about this, what makes light to decide to be a wave, light being a wave to being a particle, and what turns it from a wave into a particle is the act of observation of a conscious mind. So suddenly, and they've done experiments, there's something called the dual slit experiment or the twin slit experiment. And it was really interesting. Again, without going into detail, they found that light, when it is not measured or observed, is a wave. But the minute that it is measured or it is observed, it changes from a wave to a particle. And the experiment's been done thousands of times now. So imagine this, it's a wave and then it's a particle, just because somebody's looked at it. Now, if light waves are made of these tiny waves and particles, that means that everything we are seeing, the whole visual world, literally is a wave until we experience it, until we see it. But then it was discovered in the 1920s that it's not only light that has this weird, what's called wave-particle duality. It was discovered that electrons do. Now, this is very important because whereas light is very strange, because it is, light is something, it can only travel at the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. It has the particles of light, they are called point particles because they're so tiny, they don't exist in space. So light is weird. But they discovered that electrons, which are little bits of matter that make up the atoms around us, they also have the same wave-particle duality, which means that the table next to you or the chair you are sitting on, the computer you're looking at, you're talking to me now, also doesn't exist if it's not observed. Now, this suddenly starts bringing up huge questions about the true nature of reality. Now, the reason I then bring this back is because if we effectively now, again in quantum mechanics, there's something called the collapse of the wave function. Now, a guy called Max Born, in 1928, I think it was, it might have been the early 1930s, said, well, funnily enough, some of the strange things we're seeing in quantum mechanics seems to suggest that subatomic particles and light waves, they are not real in the sense that we understand them to be. They're like a statistical wave, like we have a term, there's a crime wave. Now, a crime wave can be plotted on a graph, and it's a wave. And he argued that these subatomic particles work in the same way. They're mathematical, which means they don't actually exist until they're observed. So suddenly we have the idea of three-dimensional reality, light, or everything that's made up of atoms, suddenly is brought into existence by the act of measurement. And I argue this is what we are all doing. You and I are now observing together, and we are creating this reality around us. And all human beings and all conscious beings all create this external world that we think is external. So suddenly your dreams are suddenly more real, or as just as real as this. Because, for instance, when you dream, I always say this to people, you see other people and you see shadows. So what's illuminating the world of your dreams? Because there's no sun, but something is illuminating it. And this means that there is an alternate reality that we perceive under certain circumstances, and we move into that alternate reality, and everything is brain created. So this means now that near-death experiences suddenly can become anticipatory of what you believe because you're creating it, but it doesn't mean it's not real. And in my work, I do a lot of work with people who are doing research. Have you ever come across the concept or something called dimethyltryptamine?
Yes.
Okay. So in dimethyltryptamine that when people have, because there's so many similarities between dimethyltryptamine trips, in raised commas, and near-death experiences. They are very, very similar. And again, the guy that writes the foreword of my new book is a neuroscientist, and he's been doing research on the similarities between NDEs and ayahuasca and DMT. When people take DMT, they encounter entities. They encounter creatures, they encounter the snakes, they encounter lots of things. Now, my research friends have been telling me there's a research project that's taking place now at Imperial College in London. And one of the guys that's involved is a friend of mine. And he told me, and this is quite extraordinary, he said that he was taking it's an experiment to see about what happens when people have DMT. It's in controlled circumstances in laboratories. And what they're doing is they're taking DMT intravenously. So they're being injected. The DMT has been injected into a vein, gets into their blood system, and they have an experience. And this guy was going every 2 weeks to do the DMT trips. And the DMT trip usually lasts about 4 or 5 minutes. But within the DMT world, it can last hours. Because, of course, in my work, I also discuss how our concept of time is also one of these strange things that we assume we understand, but we don't. But when he took the DMT, he told me that the DMT hit him and he felt himself crashing out of his chest, flying into another place. And he's floating in this place. And this entity comes over to him, this being that looked like alien grey. And it comes over to him and it prods him on the shoulder. And it turns around and it says, you shouldn't be doing this way. And then it backed away from him. Then he found himself coming to. And he turned around to his associate and said, that's really weird. One of the entities spoke to me, addressed me, looking at me as if it was independent of me in some way, not an hallucination. He then comes back 2 weeks later, takes the intravenous drug. He's back in the DMT, what's called the DMT cage. The same entity comes over, looks at him again and said, I told you last time, this is not the way you should do it. Now, as my friend said, he said, that wasn't my imagination. That being remembered me, remembered telling me that I shouldn't be there. And it was a shock to him because he's a scientist. And he said, that being was not, he was real. He'd been waiting for me to come. Now, then the question is then, so when we meet these entities in near-death experiences, when we meet them in dream sequences, lucid dreaming, out-of-body experiences, they're real. They're as real as you and I are. So we may be creating them using our brain to create them, but they become independent of us. And there was a fascinating experiment in 1970 in Toronto, in Canada. Have you heard about this? It's called the Toronto experiment. Okay. What happened was there were a group of people, academics and wives of academics and husbands of academics, who were playing around with Ouija boards. You know, the Ouija board where you have a glass and you move it around and you have letters and it speaks to you and it gives you messages. They were quite intrigued by this because they were getting quite precise messages. And they thought, we as rational scientists realize that in fact our muscles are moving the glass subconsciously. So they said, but this is weird. So if we're doing it subconsciously, why are we doing it? And where's the information coming from? So they were very clever. So what they decided to do was to create a spirit, to create a ghost. And what they did was they asked one of the group to go away and write a story about a completely fictional character from the past. And this lady wrote a story about a guy called Philip Aylesford living in the 1670s in England. And he was an aristocrat. And he lived in a castle, which does actually exist, in Warwickshire in England. And he was an outsider. It was it was after the period of the English Civil War and everything. And this guy was a Roman Catholic, so therefore he was an outsider. He was in a loveless marriage, and he falls in love with a gypsy girl. And he has an affair with the gypsy girl. His wife finds out, and he, in desperation, he's so depressed, he commits suicide by jumping off the battlements of the castle. But that was just fictionalized. But then the group, when they were getting together, decided to see if they could communicate with him. And he started communicating with them. And he started telling them things about his life that they hadn't made up. And they thought, this is weird. It's as if we are creating him by our anticipation. And then it started getting really weird because the table started to levitate and they had poltergeist activity and all these things. Now, again, if anybody's interested here, if you go onto YouTube, they did this on a TV program in Toronto. And it was a live TV, and the table levitates live on TV. So the question was, what was happening here? And I'd argue that they had collectively created this being because they wanted to believe in him. So suddenly then I come to the conclusion, because by background I'm a sociologist, and I was fascinated by this because it suggests that when people believe in something really strongly, they can make it happen. So when we have certain religious groups who have very strong religious beliefs, and people who don't share their religious beliefs can't understand why they believe them, I'd argue that when these groups get together, they're wanting their beliefs to be so strong, they manifest them. So they see evidence of their religious beliefs anywhere. So all the religious groups around the world technically are correct because they are creating the reality to fulfill their anticipations of that reality. And this is where I call it the egregorial. I'll give another fascinating example. There was a young researcher, a young woman who in the 1920s, a young Belgian lady called Alexander Neil. She took herself off to Tibet. She wanted to learn about Tibetan belief systems and everything. And her and a group of friends did what the people did in 1970. They decided to create a thought form. Now, within Tibetan Buddhism belief systems, there is a term called a tulpa. And a tulpa is a thought form you can create that will become independent of you. And her group, they created a little Buddhist monk. And they thought about him in great detail. And suddenly he appeared. And he followed them. And at first he was a very rotund, happy-go-lucky, smiling little entity. And then he became malevolent. and he became independent and became nasty. And they had to think him away because he became so dangerous. Now, that, again, tulpa thought form is what's called an egregore. Now, I believe that reality is like that by our anticipation, we all create the reality around us. Because I found with my little group, when we get together, my group, and we talk about these ideas, do you ever get the feeling, you know, when, like you and I now, when you're talking and discussing something you're really interested in, it's as if there's a third person created, isn't there? And you get a group of people, and there's this, it's bigger than you. It's again a theory. It's called the insanity of crowds. When you get a huge group of people together in a football stadium or in a religious stadium, you feel this energy that's been created by the anticipation of people around them. And I argue, and I think I'm the only writer in the world that's pulling this together and saying, well, this is what UFOs are about. This is what flying saucers are about. As you know, I do the event in Southern California now every year at Contact in the Desert. And this is one of the things I've noticed. I mean, for instance, last year at Contact in the Desert, which takes place in Indian Wells, last year, a group of them went outside to see if they could see UFOs. And one manifested. It flew over them and then flew into the distance and then flew back again about 20 minutes later because they all came in excited and said, if UFOs just flown across. Now, what's the chances of a UFO deciding for no apparent reason to appear over the air above a UFO conference? Now, I'll guarantee that nobody outside of the event saw that UFO, but the group did, because the group were anticipating it, and that UFO brought itself, because of their collective thoughts, it could bring itself in from wherever it is into this world and then flew across. So to me, there is powerful evidence for this. So this means near-death experiences are real and they happen, and they're a hallucination, but they're a genuine hallucination. And this is why people from different cultures perceive near-death experiences in a subtly different way. It doesn't mean the near-death experiences aren't real. It means we're looking at it the wrong way, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. I wanted to kind of take it to do a deeper dive on that and try to understand.
Okay.
What do you think is happening in the brain during near-death experiences? Is it that in our normal state we don't see these realities because we have kind of, our brain has blocked certain things because of the ideas that we are bought into?
Very good. Yeah, no, effectively, this has been a long-held belief by researchers into the paranormal, that the brain acts as an attenuator. The brain is there to take information out rather than put it in. In other words, there is far more information, in visual information, sound information out there than our brain processes, because our brain is attuned to exist within this reality, this matrix, whatever we want to call it. So it's fine-tuned to do that. But it has the ability to take in much more information and see much more information and perceive much more information, but it stops itself. And this idea was first put forward by a guy called Henri Bergson, who was a French philosopher who was around the 1890s. And Bergson's ideas then carried forward with other writers and other researchers, such as a guy called C.D. Broad, who was a British philosopher. And in the 1950s, in 1954, an English writer called Aldous Huxley did a series of experiments with it was some mind expanding substance. It wasn't psilocybin, but it was another substance he used, peyote, I think it was. And he wrote a book called The Doors of Perception. And in that, he posited the same idea, that the brain takes information away. But it's never, ever been proven until very, very recently. And I think it was about 2019, might even be nearer to this time, when a group of researchers at the University of Sussex, which is literally about 20 miles from where I'm talking to you now, what they did was they had people take psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms. And what they did was, when the people took psilocybin, what they did was they placed the people's brains who were taking the psilocybin under fMRI scanners and PET scans and things, so they could really model what was happening in the brain in real time when somebody took these mind-expanding substances. Now, they expected that what would happen is, when the psilocybin took effect in the brain, it would make bits of the brain communicate more effectively to create the hallucinations. Much to their astonishment, the opposite happened. It switched parts of the brain off. So this was the first time then there was evidence that hallucinogenic substances don't act in the way we think they do. They stop the brain being effective in its taking information out. Now, this was astonishing, but not at all surprising to me and my associates, because this is what we've argued for a long time. So holding that idea in mind then, that the brain takes information out, what takes place at the near-death experience? What is it neurologically and neurochemically that creates the near-death experience? And I think I know, okay? And, you know, I've said to my scientific friends and various other people, tell me I'm wrong about this. And nobody's ever come back to me, okay? Which suggests I'm onto something here. On the 49th day of gestation, the pineal gland and the pituitary gland within the embryo sit at the back of the throat, okay? And as the baby develops, they move from the back of the throat to the center of the brain, where they split into the pituitary gland and the pineal gland. There's a reason why I'm going here, by the way. Now, when it sits at the back of the throat, it's called the epiphysis. That's the technical term for it. Now, imagine that, as it say, it moves up to the center of the brain. Now, when it moves up to the center of the brain, it creates what's something called Rathke's pouch or Rathke's cleft, which is a tiny kind of like a channel that runs down from the pineal gland to the back of the throat. But the sadhus in India, the holy men, have a technique that's called Kakara Mudra. And Kakara Mudra, they train themselves to take their tongue and take it to the back of the throat. And the reason they do this is they want to taste a substance called amrit, or the nectar of transcendence, which is an acidic taste that they get at the back of the throat, which they then flick forward, and they go into altered states of consciousness. They go into trance states. Now, I've always been intrigued why they do this, and I think I know why. What I think takes place in altered states of consciousness and even in near-death experiences is something very peculiar. The pineal gland, as you probably know, is fairly unique within the brain. In the brain, it mirrors itself. There's a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. But not only that, but underneath it are little other structures that are also mirrored, like the amygdala and the hippocampus and everything. And there's two of them. On each side of the brain, there's two of everything, with the exception of the pineal gland and a couple of other glands that sit further down. And when people first took open the brain of dead people, there was the first thing they noticed. They opened up the skull and they saw the hemispheres and they saw underneath. They said, oh, there's two of everything except this really weird little thing that sits in the middle. And René Descartes, the French philosopher, concluded that's where the human soul was located, in the pineal gland. And it's called the pineal gland because it looks like a little pine cone. Now, the pineal gland exists for a specific purpose. It needs to generate an enzyme, I think it's an enzyme, called melatonin, chemical in the brain. Okay. Now, melatonin is the chemical that makes us fall asleep. So when we start to feel drowsy and asleep, going asleep, it's the melatonin that's been released by the pineal gland and it spreads over the brain and we feel sleepy. Now, the reason it's located where it is remember I was telling you about the channels that go from the eyes to the back of the brain. They cross at something called the optic chiasma, the two nerves, and the pineal gland sits directly above it. Now, the reason it sits directly above it is the pineal gland is also the third eye. It's light sensitive. That's why it's known to being the third eye. That's why in Hindu tradition, people have that little thing in the center of the forehead. And it's because it's a symbol of the pineal gland that sits behind. And people who, for instance, I don't know if you know the Kashmiri shavists.
I've heard of it.
Okay, they venerate the pineal gland. In one of my previous books, I discussed how they even wear special turbans to protect it. Okay, it's that sacred to them. So there's something very strange about the pineal gland. But anyway, when we see things, it's the daytime and light is coming through our eyes, the light goes down the optic nerves and where it crosses. And the pineal gland is sensitive to this, and it knows that there's light, or the chemicals progressing the details are active. So when it goes dark, the pineal gland realizes that it's going dark because there's no activity in the nerves. And that's when it chooses to release the melatonin. So you know it's going dark, so you know you need to go to sleep. And that's why people, when they're on transatlantic flights and things, take melatonin to go to sleep on the plane. Now, melatonin is very, very chemically close in terms of its molecular structure to another substance. And that other substance is dimethyltryptamine. The only difference between dimethyltryptamine, the structure of the molecule of dimethyltryptamine, and the molecule of melatonin, I think I'm right in saying, is either it has 2 more hydrogen atoms or it has 2 less hydrogen atoms. But that's all it needs to change melatonin into dimethyltryptamine. But the proof needs to be, well, if it creates dimethyltryptamine, why has dimethyltryptamine never been found in the brain? That's one of the big arguments. 2017, a lady called Jimo Borgigin at the University of Michigan. Why this is not world famous, I have no idea, but I'm delighted because I'm one of the few writers writing about it. Jimo Borgigin, a Japanese-American researcher at the University of Michigan, for the first time discovered dimethyltryptamine in the pineal gland of live rats, which means that the mammalian brain has been evolved to work with dimethyltryptamine, because they thought, well, it means it's a neurotransmitter, it's a neurochemical, it's something that's there to help the neurons communicate. So suddenly, dimethyltryptamine is in the pineal gland. The question was, how did it get there? I'd argue it got there because it was melatonin that had been converted into dimethyltryptamine. And in fact, there's an associate of mine called Beach Barrett in America who's come up with this term of calling it metatonin, endogenous DMT. Okay, so long story short, how does it link in with the near-death experience? I know that Rick Strassman, who was the guy that wrote an amazing book called The Spirit Molecule, I guess you know about Rick Strassman as well, yeah? And you know Strassman was a researcher at the University of New Mexico. He was the American government financed research into DMT, and he had a load of volunteers who took DMT and said they experienced entities and all the other weird DMT stuff. Now, Rick used the term once that DMT is our reality modulator. Now, I believe, and I know Rick was involved with some of the research with Jimo Borgigin as well. So here we have evidence that DMT is in the brain. And what's it there for? Now, I believe it's there to create hallucinations. It's there to create out-of-body experiences. It's there to create near-death experiences. And I believe at the point of death, the pineal gland starts to excrete DMT. And when it does so, it brings about all of the experiences of a near-death experience, because the evidence is overpowering. The similarities between a standard DMT experience and a near-death experience are extraordinary. All of the moody traits that I talked about earlier on are all part of a DMT trip. The encounters with aliens, the encounters with dead people. And in my book, I discuss an academic paper that the guy that wrote the foreword to it, Dr. Pascal Michael, wrote an academic paper a few years ago. And it's extraordinary because he managed to find somebody who had had a near-death experience who'd also taken DMT. In fact, a substance called 5-MeO-DMT, which is even more powerful than DMT. And it was a person who was in the wonderful position of knowing both experiences. Now, that person is none other than Ibn Alexander III, who you may have heard of. Okay, this world famous neurosurgeon that had his near-death experience. So, and I cite this in my book, the similarities between both of Ibn's experiences. Now, clearly, there is a massive link here, and we need to explore it. You know, to naively just say that the near-death experience is an hallucination is too simplistic. For me, we have to look, and that's why I go into the anthropology. This is why I go into the neurochemistry in great detail. You know, so if you want to read a book on Joe Bloggs has a heart attack, feels he's out of his body, sees Jesus and goes to heaven and does all these wonderful things, that's fine. There are scores of books that will describe that. If you want a book that's going to actually make you think about what is really taking place in a near-death experience, you check out my book. It's a very different approach. In other words, I believe that everybody that's had a near-death experience, it's genuine, it's real. You know, I shared a platform last year in America with Daniel Brinkley. Literally, he was sitting next to me, and I was discussing with him his experiences. It clearly is something extraordinary, but it's linked to UFOs. It's linked to alien abductions. They're all the same phenomenon. In my book, I have evidence of individuals whose near-death experiences are absolute alien abductions. They are identical. Also, in my anthropological studies, I found really obscure academic papers that had been written in the 1970s and 60s by researchers, anthropologists who are researching in New Guinea. In fact, not only New Guinea, but a place called New Britain, which is a tiny island, an island off New Guinea. These people lived in complete isolation from Western society. They have near-death experiences. They describe in great detail exactly the same experiences, but theirs are slightly different. Because if you just look at the narrative of what they're taking place, they're alien abductions. There was one particular one where a guy in his near-death experience, get this, went up a ladder. There was this house, and it was on stilts, and a ladder came down from the house, and he walked up to the ladder and he felt himself being pulled up into the house, as he called it. And then he realized the house was hovering above the ground. Now, somebody who'd not come across the idea of UFOs, well, how would you describe a UFO? It's a house hovering in the air. He says it absolutely precisely. The aliens take him in and they start to dismember him. They start to do experiments on him. But it was a near-death experience. But anybody who knows anything about alien abductions and everything else will say, this is typical of an alien abduction. And I'm, again, a rare writer that's saying, yes, because they're the same thing. They're the same thing.
And all these experiences have linked to the DMT activity that's happening in the brain.
I believe so. I believe it is the DMT, because if you look at the entities that people experience when they have DMT, the Terence McKenna machine elves, which is the technical term for them, they seem to have very similar motivations and actions to the alien greys. But on top of this, you then have the additional element, which I bring in, of shamanic traveling. You know, the shamans and how the shamans train themselves to get into out-of-body experiences, to encounter the higher world or the lower world. And when they're there, they also encounter other entities that give them information. Like, for example, one of the strangest things is ayahuasca. Why it is that ayahuasca works. And I don't know if you know about this. You do?
About ayahuasca. Yeah, ayahuasca, I know about ayahuasca.
And you know about the two plants and how they brought together. Okay. So just for what all our watchers on this, our audience on this, ayahuasca is made up of two substances, two elements from two plants, Banisterium apis capi and Psychiatra viridas. So Banisterius is a kind of a vine that glows around the trees. That's why it's called the vine of death, or the vine of immortality. And the other plant is the plant, I think I'm right in saying, contains the active DMT hallucinatory substance, the Psychiatra viridas. Now, there are tens of thousands of plants in the Amazon basin. These two plants were brought together by the shamans to create ayahuasca. The question is, why these two plants? And it's really interesting. If you take the leaves of Psychiatra viridas that has the DMT in them and you chew them and you take them into your stomach, what happens is nothing. You don't have any kind of psychedelic experience. And you don't, for a very important reason, because the lining of the stomach excretes something called monoamine oxidase, or MAO. And what that does is effectively stops the DMT crossing from the stomach into the bloodstream. It stops it. So you can't do it. However, if you then mix with the Psychiatra viridas elements of the Banisterium apis capi, you have a substance called harmaline or harmine. That's an MAO inhibitor. So when you bring the two together and the psychedelic substance starts to get to the edge of the stomach and the MAO comes out to stop it, the harmine or harmaline stops the MAO being effective. It nullifies it, allowing it to pass into the bloodstream. Now, when the anthropologists discovered this, they said to the shamans in Amazon, how did you know this? How did you know of all the plants that these two were the ones you brought together? You know, what's the chances statistically of getting the two right? Because remember, these guys don't understand about chemistry of the body. And they turned around and they said, the plants told us. And what happened was, they said, years ago, when we used to go shamanic traveling, because, you know, it's shamanic travel, it's either drumming or repetitive dancing and everything. And they can get themselves into like a DMT state by dancing and things, because they have, and in my books, I argue it's to do with their temporal lobes, because many of them have temporal lobe epilepsy. And temporal lobe epilepsy opens the doors of perception in people that they don't need to take the substances to go into these states. And I'll guarantee if there are people out there that have TLE, you know exactly what I mean. So they can go into this place. And when they went into this place, they were approached by entities, which they call the plants, but they were entities, they were aliens. And the entities said to them, if you want normal people to be able to experience what you're experiencing now, we'll show you. And in the dream state, they took them into the jungle, and they said, take this plant here and take this plant here and bring them together and make them into a brew. And that will allow normal people to have the experiences you experience. And this is what they did. And they came back and they made the brew. Now that means that the entities knew how to have people mentally go into these states so they can experience, so they can talk to them. Isn't that astonishing? That suggests that whatever these entities are, they are trying to communicate with us. And they are guiding us, they are involved in us. But then you have the billion-dollar question, well, what are the Greys up to? What are the other entities up to? What great game is being played here? And I'm very much in team Jacques Vallée on this, you know, that there is a much bigger thing going on here than just UFO encounters and alien abductions, because the aliens seem to be almost like DMT entities. They're kind of jokey sometimes. They play with us. They come in different forms just to make it look like the people who've had experiences are making it up or are ridiculous. You know, and I know so many UFO encounters involve things that are ridiculous. There was the old guy with the pancake, and the aliens gave him a pancake. You know, just so weird. It's like it's a game. It's like a bit of fun, a trickster almost.
There's one more element I wanted to bring to this whole picture is the role of Kundalini, Kundalini experiences. Do you think it's something that activates the pineal gland
Yes.
to, how
Yeah,
does
it's the Kundalini experience is central to my hypothesis. As you know, the Kundalini experience is the argument that there are two channels that run down the spine, the Ida and the Pingala. And that the legend is that the foot of the spine is this kind of coiled serpent. And under certain circumstances, it can be released and it fires up through along the Ida and the Pingala, and then it explodes into the center of the head, and it gives you the most extraordinary experiences. This is absolutely central because it's to do again with DMT, because they found DMT within the spinocerebral fluid. So that is a definite. So that's absolute definite proof. But in my book, I have a section that, again, I think I'm right in saying I know of no other writer in this field that's picked on this. There has been discovered there are structures within the spinal cord, and the name escapes me at the moment. I will send it to you so you've got the name of it now. But it was discovered about 1860, 1870, and these things seem to be able to communicate between each other, and they cause altered states of consciousness. So the Kundalini experience, I've never had one, but I've been told from people who've had them that they are life-changing. And I'll guarantee, if somebody did a PhD research into the similarities between Kundalini experiences, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and DMT experiences, they'd find so many parallels. And I'd argue the parallels are simply because it's the same experience. It's all the same experience. And it's all to do with opening up the brain, or whatever is the human spirit within the brain that's created by the brain. Because I argue that the human brain is a receiver. It's not new. I know it's not new. People have said it for years. But the human brain exists to attune into a greater consciousness field. And that greater consciousness field is like a radio signal. And you tune in, and then you download the information you need to create you as an entity. Okay. And again, within, if you look into Eastern traditions, there is one of the central themes, and it's called the perennial philosophy, which was Aldous Huxley again. We are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. So we have a sense of individuation, but in fact, we're existing in, to use a Hindu term, Maya. We are existing within a hallucinatory reality that we are co-creating. That there is a part of us that is outside of that reality, which I call the Daemon, which can communicate with us. And the Daemon itself is part of a greater reality, which I call the Uber Daemon, which is like the Jungian collective unconscious. And above that is something called the Godamon. And the Godamon is the consciousness of everything, which in Indian culture and in Hindu culture is Brahman. And the idea that that singular consciousness comes down and reduces down into the Godamon, reduces down into the Uber Daemon, which is the consciousness of all humanity, then comes down to the Daemon, which is the consciousness of one individuated consciousness that lives many, many lives, not one, but many, many lives. It's not it is reincarnation in its literal sense. So it's a concept I call cheating the ferryman, which we can talk about in a future thing. But we live our own life time and time again. We don't live our lives as other people. Reincarnation, and when people have past life memories, it's a tuning into that next level above, the level I said, which was the Uber Daemon. So you can tune into that greater consciousness field, and then it's reduced down to an Eidolon, which is a singular consciousness that lives life once, lives life in time, in singular time. So all these levels of consciousness all drag down. And all these consciousnesses are co-creating this reality, but ultimately we are all emanations of the Daemon, which is creating everything. Then we have, as I said, reducing down. So when we take DMT, when we have near-death experiences, when we have out-of-body experiences, we move into a higher level of conscious reality. And that higher level is where we go. You know, I've got friends, I've written a book on out-of-body experiences, and I've got a number of friends who experience out-of-body experiences on a regular basis and have written books on it. And they're all in agreement with me about the model. The model works for them. And it works for them because it's scientific and it's logical and it's rational. I'm not making any claims. I'm not saying I'm any kind of guru or anybody special. And because I've not experienced any of these things, I can look at them objectively. I'm not trying subjectively to say that because I've died or I've had a near-death experience, that makes me special. On the contrary, I've just done it from reading all the books I have in here and spending the last 55 years of my life trying to understand the mysteries of what I am and what is really going on.
That's fascinating. And it seems like these studies could almost open up a new paradigm, because we have looked at ourselves from physical level, biological and chemistry from a chemical perspective, but we are not really deeply studied ourselves as light energy or electromagnetic energy. And this more knowledge in that realm could...
I think what it's doing, it's breaking away from the present scientific paradigm, which is phenomenally successful. You know, I have no issues with the present scientific paradigm. Without that, we wouldn't be able to communicate like this. But we have to recognize that 94% of the universe is missing. You know, what we believe is the universe is real is only 6% of, this is astrophysics. So we know out there's something called dark matter, there's something called dark energy. We don't know what they are, but we know that 94% of the universe is made of these things. We also know that 99.99999999996% of the interior of the atom is empty space. So it means that everything that we think is physically real isn't. Because even within the small bit of physical matter that was inside the atom are made up of effectively 6 quarks and electrons, and that's it. And quarks and electrons are point particles, which means they have no extension in space. So everything we think is real isn't. And science has known this in terms of quantum mechanics since the 1920s. We know there's something completely odd about the universe, but we are like every society. We think we've got all the answers. We think that our science is the ultimate answer to everything. And it's not. We know a tiny little bit. And the reason we are not expanding out is people aren't considering the mysteries of consciousness, scientists. They don't go there. You know, as far as they're concerned, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. It just happens to be there. But we don't understand it, as Chalmers said. So we need to start thinking, well, when people have out-of-body experiences, what is this telling us about reality? And the minute we break out of that is the minute that we will start to develop from our science a new scientific understanding of what reality really is. And I'd like to believe I'm one of the pioneers of this. And I feel we have to just start taking into account everything from human experiences, because that's where the answers lie.
And to sum up this conversation, do you think your research work is pointing towards the idea that our fundamental nature, it's light, energy?
Yeah, I think that we need to look into light far more in terms of not just physical light that we see here, but there's things called biophotons. It's light given off by living beings. And again, there is a co-researcher that I've been in contact with for many years called Professor István Bokken, who's a Hungarian who's based in America now. The work he's been doing with biophotons is phenomenal. We also know the research now being done in terms of quantum biology. Even photosynthesis works on the basis of quantum mechanics. Again, there's a guy called John Joe McFadden, who's been writing fascinating books. Again, somebody I've met and discussed my ideas with. These are powerful areas that we need to be going into, because light is the most extraordinary thing. It is extraordinary. And I'll finish off with, just think about the universe from the point of a light photon. A light photon, because it travels at the speed of light, there is no time. So from the position of a light photon leaving the surface of a quasar that ceased to exist 6 or 7 billion years ago, as far as that light particle is concerned, it's actually hitting your eye at the same instant it left the quasar 8 billion years ago. Because, of course, time doesn't exist for the light that makes us see everything. And on top of that, light, as I said before, is a point particle, which means it has no extension in space and has virtually no mass. But that's everything we see. It's as if, there's this whole universe that we are just not seeing, not sensing in one way or another. And we need to draw conclusions, just take the information like I try to do, pull it together and make a conclusion. Don't go away crazy with new age wacko stuff. You don't need to. It's there in the science. Just look at the science in the right way and see what it tells you.
I'm really interested in this work because I feel like I think this could potentially unlock whole new possibilities and potentials, especially in healing world. Maybe there's a potential to heal without cutting up a body, healing with light without having to, and that's a possibility. Maybe 100 years down the line, we'll see surgeries as like old school way of healing someone.
I think very true. And I think that when we start to realize this, we will realize that our science is very effective, but we will, to coin a phrase, it will be a quantum leap in terms of understanding of how the universe really works. And we cannot be restricted anymore. There is a very famous concept called the theory of scientific revolutions put forward by a guy called Thomas Kuhn. And I think 1970, something like that. And again, Kuhn's thesis is fascinating. It's the idea that every civilization has its scientific paradigm, but every paradigm is replaced by a greater paradigm. And that paradigm is created from the things that don't make sense in the previous science. And I think consciousness does not make sense within the present paradigm. And by looking into this, we will open Pandora's box, hopefully not to the same analogy that it destroys us, but to discover a whole new science that we were not even aware of. And we'll sit back and we say, how did we not see that?
Yes, I really think this has these insights are that magnificent. They could have a very profound impact on how we look at reality.
Totally.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And I deeply appreciate your valuable insights. And I'm very much looking forward to meet you in person at Contact.
Oh, I hope if you can get there, it'll be lovely to see you there.
Yeah, I would love to interview in person.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We need to clear it with the guys there, but I'm sure they won't mind. And I can introduce you to some fascinating people.